Welcome to the March 3rd session of the Phoenix Congress, where we are writing a blueprint for a better America. This legislative package will end poverty with universal basic income, end mass incarceration with major criminal justice reform, and end the endless wars by bringing our troops home and reducing our military budget. Today's session is the 14th of 21 public hearings on the 2022 legislative package, and we will review sections 334 and 335 relative to the purchase of unethical weapons and the closing of Guantánamo Bay military prison. These sessions will alternate between Mondays and Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern through March 28th. For those following along at home, you can find a link to the legislative package in the description below or at bit.ly/B, lowercase Dropbox. If you have any questions about today's sections, you can submit them in the chat. And if you'd like to offer questions or other testimony for future hearings, please use the link in the description below. Before starting, I'd like to invite you to join us in reciting the preamble to the Constitution of the United States to remind us of our duties as Americans and set the intention for what we are trying to do today. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. With that, I'd like to welcome the delegate from North Carolina's 9th District to continue his testimony on the blueprint for a better America.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, my name is Brian. I'm an organizer with the American Union and a Phoenix Congress delegate in good standing, representing North Carolina's 9th District. Today, we're going to continue with Subtitle B, Improving America's Moral Standing in the World. Section 334 deals with unethical weapons, and two main types are covered by this section that would prohibit the United States from purchasing or developing them, and that's landmines and lethal autonomous weapons. And so I want to talk about both of those separately, and then we'll take a look at the legislative language. So landmines have been around for a long time. According to the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, precursors were said to have been used as far back as the American Civil War. But they really started being more widespread in the world wars of the 20th century, predominantly the Second World War. And since then in Vietnam, in the Korean War, even the first Gulf War. During the Cold War, many states used these to just lay out long stretches of landmines between borders. Part of the theory was that this would reduce personnel costs, right? Instead of having to have somebody guarding your border, you could just put a whole bunch of mines out there and they would just automatically attack and blow up whenever somebody triggered one. And so that was the theory. But if you reduce the personnel costs, what are the compromises you're making to the ethical costs? How do you deal with those? Because landmines generally aren't designed specifically to kill as much as they are to maim. And one of the reasons for that is then you force your opponent to use up resources. You know, if you've got a whole troop of people advancing and one of them dies, then they can keep moving. But if you blow off somebody's leg, then you've created a new problem that your opponent has to deal with. How do they treat the wounded person? Do they bring them with? What do they do? You've created a new problem. And so landmines, in large part, are intended to intentionally harm other people for the sake of harm. And this has been a long-standing issue, not the least of which is that civilians are often the ones who get hurt by these. And so in 1997, nations of the world came together in Ottawa to develop a mine ban treaty. It is a legally binding international agreement. It bans the production, the stockpiling, and the transfer of anti-personnel mines. And it places obligations on countries to clear affected areas, assist victims, and destroy stockpiles. There's another way of looking at landmines is they can, when we talk about clearing affected areas, they're kind of sort of used to salt the earth. Remember how Romans would spread salt as they left their enemies' territory so that nothing could grow there. And to a certain extent, that's what landmines do too. They turn productive land into literally a minefield, an unproductive land. Landmines are also a violation of humanitarian law. Anti-personnel mines, they're indiscriminate, they're inhumane, and therefore they violate the basic elements of international humanitarian law. The law of war imposes certain restrictions on how combatants operate. It says combatants have to be able to distinguish between civilian and military targets, and that injuries inflicted should be proportionate with military objectives. And so anti-personnel mines, they fail both the discrimination and the proportionality tests. Going back to the landmine treaty, the mine ban treaty, the United States gave a number of reasons for backing out. Originally, they said yes, they wanted to participate, and then they said, well, we'll participate, but we want this whole list of exceptions, the largest of which being Korea. I certainly wasn't alive back in the 1950s when the Korean War was going on, but the United States still says that landmines are an essential part of our objectives in Korea. And so the United States didn't end up adopting and supporting the mine ban treaty, but the United Nations adopted it in 1997. And as a result, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines won the Nobel Peace Prize that year for their work bringing this together. As of today, 164 nations are party to this treaty. As a treaty, it would require 2/3 of the US Senate to ratify it. That's one of the reasons why it couldn't be ratification couldn't be included in a piece of legislation, because it's a separate instrument. But there have been demonstrations of widespread support for it. Back in 2010, 58 Democrats in the Senate and 10 Republicans signed a letter asking President Obama to lay out a path for the United States to adopt, to participate in the mine ban treaty. And unfortunately, things didn't get to the point where we actually ratified it. The Democrats lost a bunch of seats in the midterm elections, and it just kind of fell through the cracks. Although President Obama did use executive orders to stop purchases of landmines and to restrict their use to just Korea. Again, we're still fixated on Korea from this 1950s conflict. Sort of like, as a parent, if you told your kids, you can't come out of your room until you're sorry. Like, how long would you keep a child locked in their room before you'd recognize that your attempt at discipline wasn't having the intended effect? It's something that America ought to think about all these decades and generations later. Anyways, when President Donald Trump he issued an executive order that reversed a lot of these things and allowed for the United States to start purchasing and stockpiling landmines again. And this goes back to what we've discussed in a number of other sections, which is why it's important to put these policy changes in law so they're not subject to the whims of the executive, that one president from the next can't just keep changing the policy. And so that's what this legislation would do. It would prohibit buying landmines and other unethical weapons. Before we look at the actual legislative language, we'll talk about the other unethical weapon that this applies to, and these are lethal autonomous weapons. If you've ever seen a Terminator movie, you can imagine the Terminators as autonomous weapons that whose sole purpose is to hunt down human beings and kill them. And we have the technology to do that sort of things, those sort of things today. The New York Times reported last year that Israel assassinated a top Iranian nuclear scientist at the end of 2020 using a remotely controlled AI-assisted machine gun, where they set it up to figure out when his car was coming down the road, and when it identified him, shot him and killed him. And the argument in favor of this is, well, the alternative was blowing up the vehicle, and there were innocent civilians in the vehicle. So by just using AI to assassinate just one person, that causes less harm. But there are a lot of reasons why we don't want to open this door, or we don't want to go down this path of AI-assisted, the AI-assisted killing of human beings. The website autonomousweapons.org offers 7 different reasons why, about warnings about different dangers. And I'd just like to go through their list real quickly. First is unpredictability. Skynet from the Terminator movies, right? Is you put the AI in charge, and then if it someday decides that it's the humans that are the real threat, then you never know what could happen. Anytime that you're putting software in charge of making life and death decisions, there is unpredictability. And we saw self-driving cars that occasionally make mistakes. But those are mistakes. Lethal autonomous weapons, their primary purpose is to be weapons, to cause harm, to kill. And so this is an area that you don't want that to happen unpredictably. The second of their danger signs, dangers, is escalation. And the stock market, this happens in the stock market occasionally, where automated trading programs get triggered by something another automated trading program is doing. And then all of a sudden you get these big wild swings in the stock market, because it's machines acting to machines faster than, and just escalating things. And if those machines are the kind that are designed to kill human beings, this is not an area where you would want rapid escalation outside of human control. Another danger is proliferation. The more of these that we put out there, the more of these that are developed, the greater the likelihood that they'll end up in the hands of dictators, terrorists, people who will use them specifically in disruptive ways, and instead of nominally the way that we'd like to think the United States will use them as tools of defense. Another risk is this would create lower barriers to conflict. Rather than having to recruit a whole army full of soldiers, you can just send out swarms of AI to go out and fight your battles for you, which leads to another risk of mass destruction, where again you don't need one person for each weapon that you're utilizing. One person can control many weapons, since AI would be doing most of the heavy lifting. One of the biggest dangers, though, is probably the selective targeting of groups, where artificial intelligence could be used to target people based on age, gender, race, ethnicity, even religious dress, and target them that way. Again, the argument would be, well, if you could just target the enemy's soldiers based on their uniform, then that would be a good use of this. But once we open Pandora's box, there's a lot of really dangerous and scary things that can come out, and so it's best to keep it shut. The last warning danger that they have on their site talks about an AI arms race. And if we get into an arms races, that the very dynamic, it favors speed over safety. Let's get it done as fast as we can. We're in a race, as opposed to taking the time to think about what we should be doing. What's the line from Jurassic Park? Your scientists were so concerned about whether or not they could They didn't stop to think about whether or not they should. This is not, again, lethal autonomous weapons are not an area where we want to encourage that sort of putting speed over safety. It's also been argued that it's also been pointed out that these systems, they violate the dictates of the public conscience and undermine the principles of humanity, because they wouldn't be able to apply compassion or human judgment to decisions to use force. These are human characteristics. The International Red Cross has recommended that states regulate lethal autonomous weapons, and they have three core pillars. First is no human targets. Second is to restrict unpredictability. And the third is to require human control. And I'd like to go ahead and pull up the legislation. We can look at how we try and do that with this section. All right, so we've got prohibiting purchase of landmines and lethal autonomous weapons. Now, this section of the United States Code deals with procurement. And so it would be a restriction on the kind of things that we could buy, specifically contracts, any contracts that would include development or procurement of unethical weapons. Statement of purpose is that humans, not machines, are legal and moral agents in military operations and are responsible for ensuring and understanding that any attack complies with the laws of war. This language and a bunch of some of the definitions in this section come from a paper, Autonomous Weapon Systems, a road mapping exercise, which was published in 2019 on Georgia Tech's Robot Lab website. And they came up with some good defining language, so we used it here. So the United States would be prohibited from developing or procuring unethical weapons, and we define unethical weapons as devices which are intended to maim, kill, or otherwise injure a human being without direct action initiated by a human operator. Again, this goes back to the International Red Cross recommendation of requiring human control. And it specifically exempts things like missile defense systems, where the goal of an automatic response is towards a missile or other inanimate object, not a person. Those are explicitly exempt. Development means the active process of creating and includes designs that enable conversion from compliant to non-compliant categories solely by software updates. This is important, that you can't just upgrade, build the system and just leave out one software patch that would make it a lethal autonomous weapon. This would require that it was physically incapable of being upgraded to a lethal autonomous weapon. Couldn't just be done by software. And then defining the term lethal autonomous weapons means weapon systems that, once activated, select and engage human targets without further intervention by a human operator. As far as penalties, we put a $1 million fine for any violation, a minimum of a $1 million fine to go to the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, and a requirement that any of all the specifications about any violation, including the quantity, cost, technical details, would all be turned over to the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. So if this were violated, that information should then be made public. Yeah, so that's what this section does. The best time to address this was 5 years ago. The second best time is this year. It needs to be done. We have an opportunity to be leaders, to set an example for the rest of the world and say, we're not going to go down this road. We're not going to buy these. We're not going to develop these. To quote Sarah Connor from the Terminator movies, there is no fate but what we make. And this is really an opportunity for us to improve our moral standing in the world. So with that, Mixed Chair, I think that concludes my testimony for section 334, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question. If we don't develop this technology and other countries do, won't we be at a disadvantage?
Um, yeah, I mean, there's a non-zero chance of that. If you ever seen the movie Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, the Russians developed this doomsday device, and as the Dr. Strangelove, figures out what are the consequences, and we should build mine shafts. The Russians are probably already building mine shafts where people can live out this nuclear apocalypse. And so his line is, "We must not allow a mine shaft gap. Like there's some other country is doing it, we've got to always keep up with them." And, well, what if we don't? What if we don't? We're the ones who don't escalate things. Thinking the worst of others, expecting the worst from other people, from other countries, that's a policy choice. And instead, we can make a policy choice to be a force for peace and good and calm, rational decisions in the world.
Thanks. If we are banning lethal autonomous weapons that engage human targets, can they develop weapons that target other things that aren't people, like a killer drone designed to fly around a city and find a certain make and model of a car, check the license plate, and blow it up?
Yes, that's the short, unfortunate answer is, yeah, the prohibition here is specifically on engaging human targets. Again, so that you can exempt things like missile defense systems, and yeah, so it's possible, but let's focus on yeah, unfortunately, yes, that's the answer to your question.
Seeing no further questions, section 334 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Improving America's Moral Standing in the World. You may proceed to section 335.
All right, thank you, Mixed Chair. Section 335 is relative to closing Guantanamo Bay military prison. And just a brief history. So back more than 20 years ago, on January 11th, 2002, it was just a few months after the September 11th attacks, and a Navy photographer snapped a picture of 20 hooded men shackled and kneeling inside barbed wire fences. If you look at the thumbnail for this video, that's how this started. And they were the first of about 780 men who ultimately got detained inside Guantanamo Bay military prison. And virtually, 95% of them have all been released. But we're still down to a few dozen men still in Cuba. And like, what are the costs? What are the costs of keeping this prison open? And the first question is, what are the financial costs? And they're big. It costs more than $500 million a year, $500 million a year, to keep Guantanamo Bay military prison open. That's more than $13 million per person. And it's far, far, far greater than like the 78,000, which is what we spend for incarceration in a maximum security prison. But doing this in Guantanamo Bay has sort of a perk, which is that it's outside the boundaries of the United States. And so traditional legal protections are sort of in a little more of a gray area. And that leads us to the moral cost of keeping Guantanamo Bay open after 2 decades of holding men for years and years, many of whom have been tortured. And it serves as a reminder to the world that America is failing to live up to our own standards. And millions of school children pledge every day with liberty and justice for all. And we're failing to do that when we incarcerate people without charges for years on end. It opens us up to criticism from countries like Russia, Pakistan, Libya, Sudan, and Iran. They've all criticized us for this indefinite detention, and they're not wrong. There's been attempts in the past to close this down. President Obama promised that he would shut down Guantanamo Bay. Joe Biden has made that same pledge. President Trump took the opposite the opposite stand and pledge to keep it open. And but in any case, the roadblock is Congress. Once again, Congress has the ability to make this happen. They are the roadblock, and so by including Section 335 in this legislative package, we can clear that roadblock and get to where we want to go, which is improving our moral standing in the world by closing Guantanamo Bay military prison. So where we're at today is there's 39 men left. I guess I just want to point out that out of these nearly 800 people who've been incarcerated there, they are exclusively Muslim men, and some of them as young as teenagers. There's been a wide variety, but we're down to 20. I'm sorry, 39, and 20 of them are cleared to leave. Most of the men who are still there are cleared to leave. We're just not letting them leave. Some of them have been cleared to leave for years, for more than a decade. Only we don't let them go. This is something that needs to be addressed, and so our legislation will address that. Let me try sharing the screen again and we'll go through this real quick. So Section 335 would require the president to close this by the end of February 2023. So about 120 days, 4 months. This language comes from a Senate bill that was introduced years back, I believe by Senator Feinstein, who to close the prison. That's where this language comes from. So 120 days, and prohibits using any money to keep it open after that time. There's an option for an 120-day extension, and it would and so everyone who's there currently could be transferred to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and detained, imprisoned there if they are as part of a pre-trial or while serving a sentence, as long as they've been charged with something. If the people who have been there for years and years and years haven't been charged with anything, then it's time to let them go if we're not going to charge them with anything. In that case, any of those transfers would need to comply with the Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees, United Nations Convention against torture, and make sure that we're not turning them over to some place where they could find themselves in just as bad or a worse scenario. And any individual who asserts a well-founded fear of torture, abuse, or persecution has the opportunity to have a judicial review before their transfer, and make sure that everyone else is released. That people fall into these categories: either they're being charged with something or they're not. And if they're not, then we shouldn't be holding them any longer. That's what that's what Section 335 does. The Supreme Court's given mixed opinions about the legality of Guantanamo Bay. I remember in June of 2004, they ruled in Russell versus Bush that detainees had a right to a habeas review. It was a 5-4 decision, and they agreed. Look, they have the right to due process of law. Unfortunately, as we've seen in other parts of this of our law, that due process can mean all sorts of things. And so the due process, they've established civilian review boards. It's been a very murky legal process for the detainees in Guantanamo Bay. Actually, just a couple hours ago, there was a new Supreme Court ruling that Abu Zubaydah, who according to court filings. This is from CBS News. He was waterboarded at least 83 times after he was captured in Pakistan back in 2002. He spent more than 11 days in a coffin-sized confinement box. Coffin-sized confinement box. And 29 hours in an, quote, extremely small enclosure. So if coffin-sized box isn't an extremely small enclosure, I don't even want to know what he was subjected to. And after being tortured in various countries around the globe, he tried to get information about where he was held, and the Supreme Court has ruled today that that could be hidden as a state secret. We have a real opportunity to improve our moral standing in the world by closing Guantánamo Bay military prison. In January this year, there's a group of independent human rights experts that were appointed by the UN, and they released a statement condemning this. And they said, quote, Guantánamo Bay is a site of unparalleled notoriety, defined by the systemic use of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment against hundreds of men brought to the site and deprived of their most fundamental rights. They concluded it was a stain on the US government's commitment to the rule of law. And they're right. John Oliver looked at at the history of Guantanamo Bay on an episode of Last Week Tonight. And he concluded, when you see a bumper sticker that says freedom isn't free, this is what it means. Standing up for our highest ideals, even when it requires accepting a certain amount of risk. It's time to close Guantanamo Bay. Establishing justice is our first duty under the Constitution, and this is an essential part of doing that. With that, Mixed Chair, I think that concludes my testimony for Section 335, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Seeing no questions, Section 335 is assigned to the Subcommittee on Improving America's Moral Standing in the World. I'd like to thank the delegate for his testimony.
Thank you. This was a tough couple of hearings, but we're supposed to be the good guys in the world, and we can do better. So I am looking forward to starting the next section of the legislation and promoting the general welfare.
Fantastic, yeah. And gorgeous. Well, the next session of the Phoenix Congress will be held on Monday, March 7th. We will review sections 401 to 414 relative to a public option for health insurance and requiring negotiation of prescription drug prices. This hearing is adjourned.